The early morning express train departed from New York City shortly after 7 in the morning. As the sprawling urban landscapes gradually gave way to the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of New England, Alexander Harrison held a cup of coffee that had long since lost its warmth. He had barely taken a sip. Between his hands rested an old, worn leather wallet, from which he gently extracted a photograph slightly faded by the passage of time. In the picture, Ivy smiled radiantly under the golden light of an autumn sunset in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Beside her, a 6-year-old girl hugged a heavy textbook with the exact same boundless enthusiasm that other children usually reserved for a brand-new toy. That little girl was Lucy. A soft, melancholic smile appeared on Alexander's face as he traced the edges of the image. He whispered into the quiet carriage, wishing she could see what their daughter had become. He tucked the photograph away with the meticulous care of a man protecting an irreplaceable piece of his soul. He wore a dark navy blazer, devoid of any flashy designer logos, a crisp white shirt, and a pair of well-polished but modest shoes. Anyone sharing the train car with him would have simply assumed he was just another ordinary commuter traveling up the coast for a routine business meeting. And that was exactly how he preferred to travel through the world. Devastating personal losses had taught him that absolutely nothing in this life was eternal. First, he had to bid a painful farewell to his older brother Michael, and years later, he had to bury his beloved Ivy. Since those dark days, he understood with absolute clarity that the greatest inheritance he could ever leave his daughter was not his massive corporate fortune, but rather the freedom and opportunity to build her own unique path. At that exact same hour, the resonant chime of historic bells broke the peaceful morning silence of a university dormitory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Lucy pushed her window open, allowing the crisp September breeze to sweep into the small room, bringing with it the rich, comforting aroma of freshly roasted coffee from a nearby corner cafe. Slowly but surely, the renowned academic city was waking up, filling the cobblestone streets with bicycles, rushing students, and hurried, overlapping conversations. Emily, her roommate, called out a cheerful good morning while buttering a slice of toast at their tiny kitchenette counter. Lucy returned the greeting with a bright smile, her eyes sparkling with the excitement of the new academic term. Emily paused and observed the slightly oversized vintage jacket that Lucy had just slipped over her shoulders. She mentioned that she had fully expected Lucy to wear something brand new for the first day of the semester. Lucy simply smiled while fastening the final button, asking why she would ever need to do that when the new academic year was just another day to learn. She ran her hand affectionately down the sleeve of the garment, noting that the fabric was still in absolutely perfect condition. Emily, tilting her head in mild confusion, asked if she could not simply afford to buy another one to celebrate the occasion. Lucy lowered her gaze for a brief, poignant moment before softly replying that the jacket had belonged to her mother. She did not need to add another single word to explain her attachment. Emily immediately understood that the worn piece of clothing carried an immense emotional value that absolutely no luxury price tag in the world could ever possibly define or replace. As they finally stepped out of the historic brick residence hall, Lucy's mobile phone began to vibrate steadily in her pocket. She answered cheerfully, asking how the long journey north was progressing. Alexander's warm voice filled the speaker, informing her that he would be arriving in Cambridge in roughly 2 hours. He casually asked if she had everything prepared for her morning classes, to which she confidently replied that she did. He then suggested that he would love to treat her to a nice lunch afterward. Lucy hesitated for a few fleeting seconds, looking around at her fellow peers walking to class, before politely asking if they could perhaps reschedule for another day. Alexander instantly understood the unspoken reason behind his daughter's gentle refusal. His daughter desperately wanted to experience this formative stage of her life, just like any other ordinary university student, completely without special privileges and without allowing her heavy, famous surname to speak on her behalf. He responded with profound calmness, assuring her that it was perfectly fine, and expressing how incredibly proud he was of her independence. When the phone call gracefully ended, Alexander pulled out Ivy's photograph one more time, staring into her eyes. He vividly remembered a profound phrase she used to repeat quite often during their youth. She always said that a famous surname might open a heavy door, but it is entirely a person's character that decides whether they actually deserve to cross the threshold. By the time the sun reached its peak around noon, the prestigious campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was absolutely teeming with vibrant, youthful life. Conversations, the rhythmic thud of hurried footsteps, and the ever-present scent of cafeteria food echoed continuously across the majestic, ivy-covered courtyards. Lucy walked steadily toward the main dining hall, carrying the exact same faded canvas backpack she had used since high school. She had absolutely no desire to draw any unnecessary attention to herself. In fact, blending into the background had always been her preferred way of existing. On the opposite side of the long-serving counter, Carol Reed meticulously supervised the bustling lunch service with an iron fist. She had been working in that exact same building for well over 20 years. With the steady passage of time, she had somehow convinced herself that her personal experience and immediate judgment rarely, if ever, made a mistake. She firmly believed that she could accurately recognize a person's worth and background even before they spoke a single syllable. When Lucy quietly joined the back of the growing line, Carol observed her modest attire for barely a few seconds. For Carol, those fleeting moments were more than enough to cast a permanent verdict. In her mind, an unshakable, silent opinion had already been fully formed. A younger cafeteria employee nervously approached Carol to ask where to place a stack of newly washed trays, never taking her eyes off the crowded dining room. Carol responded in a hushed, judgmental tone, muttering that people always reveal exactly who they are long before they even open their mouths to speak. The young employee clearly did not understand the profound weight of the cryptic comment, and Lucy certainly did not hear it over the din of the hall. However, that terribly flawed, silent judgment had just set into motion a profound chain of events that would very soon alter the entire university's landscape forever. Routine possesses a remarkably quiet, almost invisible way of revealing who we truly are deep inside. It rarely manifests in grand, cinematic moments, but rather in those tiny, repetitive, everyday gestures that almost nobody bothers to remember, except for the unfortunate person who is forced to receive them day after day. The first few weeks at the historic university passed with the gentle, deceptive calmness typical of the beginning of any academic year. Lucy consistently found a comforting sanctuary in the ancient, cavernous reading rooms of the main library, where the comforting scent of aging paper and the soft creaking of polished oak floors seemed to make time stand still. She deeply loved the city of Cambridge precisely for that reason. She never felt rushed, and the weight of history grounded her. Every single afternoon, she crossed the central quadrangle on her way to the cafeteria, and almost without fail, she found the exact same harsh, scrutinizing gaze waiting for her. At the very beginning, Carol Reed would simply stare at her with thinly veiled disdain. Soon after, Carol began intentionally making Lucy wait a few seconds longer than the rest of the students in line. As the autumn days grew shorter, those petty seconds deliberately stretched into long, humiliating minutes. Carol would routinely shout for the next person in line, barely lifting her eyes, completely ignoring Lucy's presence. Lucy would wait in absolute, dignified silence, while other students, who had arrived long after her, received their warm meals first. One brisk morning, Lucy finally gathered enough courage to politely speak up, softly mentioning that she believed it was her turn to be served. Carol raised her eyes with an expression of supreme, calculated indifference, bluntly telling the young girl not to be in such a desperate hurry, because eventually, everyone gets to eat. Lucy nodded with ingrained politeness, quietly agreeing, and chose not to push the issue any further that day. She had wisely realized that certain bitter individuals completely stop listening long before the other person has even finished speaking their truth. That evening, back in the dormitory, Emily noticed that Lucy's dinner plate remained practically untouched on her desk. When asked if everything was all right, Lucy took several long seconds to respond, softly claiming that she was merely exhausted from her studies. Emily intuitively sensed that there was a much deeper issue hiding beneath the surface, but she also possessed the wisdom to know that certain profound silences simply require time before they can be transformed into spoken words. A few days later, Jacob Miller, a kind-hearted architecture student, bumped into Lucy near the grand entrance of the science faculty. He noted with a friendly smile that she always seemed to arrive on campus earlier than anyone else. Lucy smiled back, admitting that she loved the campus when it was still entirely peaceful. Jacob laughed, confessing that he had genuinely believed he was the only person who enjoyed listening to the morning bells before the chaotic noise of classes began. Jacob and Lucy walked together comfortably among the grand historical buildings, while the pale morning sun illuminated the majestic brick and stone facades. Without either of them consciously planning it, those quiet morning strolls quickly transformed into a cherished daily custom. Carol, meanwhile, continued her reign behind the cafeteria counter, leaning heavily on the deeply flawed intuition she had built over 20 years of service. She remained completely convinced that a mere handful of seconds was all she needed to accurately assess the character and social standing of anyone standing before her. She never felt the need to learn names, nor did she ever care to listen to explanations. When Lucy arrived at the dining hall that particular Thursday, Carol immediately locked her critical eyes onto her modest jacket once again. Lucy extended her university meal card politely. The digital reader instantly beeped, confirming without a doubt that the card was perfectly valid and fully funded. Even so, Carol deliberately held the plastic card between her fingers for several excruciatingly long seconds. She narrowed her eyes and blatantly asked Lucy if the card actually belonged to her, feigning an air of official authority. Lucy stared back in genuine astonishment, replying firmly that it obviously was hers. Carol retorted with a cold, dry gesture, claiming that in recent times it was always best to double-check everything, before practically tossing the card back across the counter. Jacob had been quietly observing the entire humiliating interaction from just a few feet away. To him, this blatant disrespect no longer looked like a random coincidence or a simple misunderstanding. When they finally sat down at a corner table to eat, he placed his fork down heavily onto his plastic tray. He looked Lucy in the eye and stated firmly that this targeted harassment had been going on for far too long. Lucy deliberately avoided his concerned gaze, murmuring softly that it was honestly not worth giving the bitter woman any significant importance. Jacob argued passionately that it was precisely because of that passive mindset that nobody ever spoke up against everyday injustices. She maintained a heavy silence, not because she believed Jacob was incorrect, but rather because she was deeply terrified that a formal complaint would instantly expose her as the privileged daughter of Alexander Harrison. She desperately wanted to prove who she was, entirely on her own merits, without hiding behind a massive corporate shadow. Later that same afternoon, Alexander called her from his temporary office in Boston. He asked how everything was progressing and whether she was fully adjusting to the demanding rhythm of university life. Lucy spent a few quiet moments gazing out at the breathtaking orange sunset, painting the rooftops of Cambridge. She answered softly that she was adjusting a little bit more with each passing day. They spoke at length about her brilliant professors, the heavy textbooks, and the vibrant culture of the city itself. Crucially, she did not mention the cafeteria or the cafeteria manager a single time during the entire conversation. When the call finally concluded, Alexander slowly placed his phone onto his mahogany desk, his brow furrowed in deep thought. There was a distinctly different, guarded tone hiding within his daughter's usually vibrant voice. It was not exactly profound sadness, but rather that specific, forced calmness people often use when they are desperately trying to prevent the people they love from worrying about them. The very next day, Lucy reluctantly returned to the cafeteria. Carol was already glaring at her even before she had managed to reach the front of the long line. Carol loudly demanded to know if Lucy had bothered to check if she had sufficient funds on her account before holding up the line. Lucy simply replied with a quiet, yes. A faint, mocking smile crept across Carol's weathered face as she loudly declared to the surrounding students that it never hurts to be absolutely sure. Lucy quietly took her plastic tray without offering a single word in response. She understood that a person did not need to scream or raise their voice to inflict deep emotional pain. Sometimes, all it took was deliberately planting a seed of malicious doubt in front of a crowd from the opposite side of a busy dining room. Carol continued to watch her walk away, utterly convinced that her seasoned experience was absolutely flawless. She remained blissfully unaware that her arrogant certainty was rapidly steering her toward the single greatest professional catastrophe of her entire life. Certain choices always appear entirely insignificant at the exact moment they are made, yet they ultimately end up violently altering the trajectories of countless lives. On that crisp morning in late October, Alexander Harrison arrived in Cambridge, entirely convinced that his only significant task was to finalize a massive philanthropic agreement with the university board. He was completely unaware that before the sun set, the multi-million-dollar legal document secured inside his briefcase would become the absolute least important thing he had brought with him. The New England sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The first vibrant yellow and orange autumn leaves carpeted the quiet corners of the historic campus square, while the university hummed with its usual energetic rhythm of academic debates, rattling bicycles, and the comforting scent of morning coffee. Shortly before 9 in the morning, Alexander confidently walked through the grand entrance of the main administration building. He walked entirely alone, without an entourage of intimidating bodyguards, without flashy photographers, carrying only a discreet leather briefcase and a simple folder bearing the subtle emblem of Harrison Biotech. Chancellor Isaac Anderson practically rushed out of his grand office to greet the billionaire personally. He extended a warm, eager hand, welcoming Mr. Harrison back to Cambridge and declaring it an absolute honor to host him once again. They immediately entered the opulent, wood-paneled boardroom, while the bright morning light streamed beautifully through the ancient, arched windows. For nearly 2 unbroken hours, they meticulously reviewed the complex blueprints and financial structures that would soon make the construction of the Ivy Harrison Research Center a reality. The massive facility would not merely house state-of-the-art scientific laboratories. It was specifically designed to provide fully funded opportunities for brilliant young researchers who would otherwise never be able to afford a career in advanced sciences. When the time finally arrived to finalize the deal, the Chancellor slowly slid the heavy, gold-embossed agreement across the polished table. Isaac stated with immense pride that with this monumental signature, their beloved university was officially embarking on a glorious new era of discovery. Alexander picked up a simple pen, signed the documents without any pomp or ceremony, and gently closed the leather folder. He spoke with a profound, grounded serenity, noting that while scientific research undoubtedly changes the future of an entire nation, true education changes the soul of an individual person. Nobody in the lavish room offered a response. There was absolutely no need to. Everyone present deeply understood and respected the profound, underlying meaning of his quiet words. As the successful meeting formally concluded, the eager University Council practically begged to host a lavish, private luncheon in his honor. They insisted that it would be a tremendous privilege to celebrate the historic moment with him. Alexander graciously thanked them for their incredibly generous offer. He paused for a few thoughtful seconds before politely declining, explaining that he already had a very important prior commitment. The Chancellor smiled knowingly, jokingly asking if it was a meeting with a high-ranking government official. Alexander shook his head with a gentle, discreet smile, softly clarifying that his highly important meeting was simply lunch with his daughter. Warm, appreciative laughter echoed throughout the grand boardroom. One of the senior professors murmured in agreement, stating that there are certainly some personal commitments that absolutely no professional title or sum of money can ever supersede. Alexander simply nodded in silent agreement. He could not possibly have agreed more. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the morning's high-level events, Lucy was just finishing a grueling molecular biology laboratory session. As she stepped out of the modern science building, Jacob quickly caught up with her on the wide concrete stairs. He casually suggested they hit the library immediately after grabbing some lunch. He joked that she was starting to navigate the complex, winding corridors of the historic campus much better than he ever could. Lucy laughed softly, admitting that she still found herself getting terribly lost on a regular basis. Jacob grinned, pointing out that getting lost simply meant that Cambridge still held a few wonderful mysteries for her to uncover. They walked side by side toward the bustling cafeteria, crossing the vibrant central courtyard together. All around them, stressed students were loudly discussing upcoming midterms, weekend sporting events, and chaotic social plans. Everything about the day appeared utterly, blissfully normal. And precisely because of that perfect, mundane normalcy, absolutely nobody could have possibly imagined the intense drama that was about to unfold. Behind the stainless steel serving counter, Carol Reed was fiercely directing the lunch rush with her usual authoritarian confidence, trusting her flawed judgment more than ever. After politely bidding farewell to the Chancellor, Alexander explicitly rejected the luxury black car that the university had arranged to wait for him outside the administration building. He much preferred to stretch his legs and walk. He genuinely loved absorbing the energetic buzz of the campus, feeling the uneven historic brick pathways beneath his shoes, and listening to the blending of youthful conversations with the distant, rhythmic chiming of the university bells. For a few nostalgic seconds, he vividly recalled Ivy once telling him that great universities do not merely teach students how to work, they fundamentally teach them entirely new ways to look at the world. He pulled his phone from his pocket, briefly considering sending Lucy a quick text message to announce his arrival, but then he slid it back into his blazer. He desperately wanted to surprise her. He could already picture the bright, genuine smile that would light up her face the moment she saw him casually standing in the middle of her everyday cafeteria. The dining hall was packed tightly with hungry students. The long serving line inched forward at an agonizingly slow pace. Lucy patiently grabbed a plastic tray and stood quietly, waiting for her turn. When she finally reached the front of the designated counter, Carol Reed slowly raised her head. The cafeteria manager deliberately did not extend her hand to process the meal card. Instead, she spent an uncomfortable amount of time glaring intensely at the young girl's modest clothing, and only after that did she finally lock eyes with her. The chaotic murmuring of the crowded dining hall continued unabated all around them. However, Jacob, standing right behind Lucy, instantly recognized the aggressive shift in Carol's body language. He had seen this exact same hostile prelude too many times before. Lucy took a deep, steadying breath, trying her absolute best to maintain her quiet composure. Suddenly, Carol planted both of her heavy hands firmly onto the stainless steel counter, leaning forward aggressively. Her harsh voice rang out loud enough to cause several nearby groups of students to abruptly stop their conversations. She demanded, with deliberate malice, to know if Lucy was absolutely certain she was standing in the correct line. At that exact, highly charged moment, the heavy wooden main doors of the cafeteria swung wide open. Alexander Harrison casually walked into the massive room. Initially, absolutely nobody noticed the quiet, unassuming older gentleman entering the space. But he clearly heard the cafeteria workers' incredibly disrespectful question ringing through the air. Without yet realizing the full scope of the situation, he had just witnessed the explosive inciting incident that would permanently alter his daughter's university experience. Sometimes, a single, incredibly arrogant sentence is more than enough to completely shatter the false reality a person has spent decades building. The cafeteria remained tense as Carol kept her piercing gaze locked entirely on Lucy. She repeated her demeaning question, asking if Lucy was truly sure she belonged there. For a few agonizingly long seconds, the immediate vicinity fell into a stunned silence. Lucy gripped her plastic card tightly, her knuckles turning white, and replied firmly that she was a student and had been eating there since the semester began. Carol did not even make a slight motion to take the card from her trembling hand. She stared at Lucy, as if trying to validate a deeply prejudiced assumption she had made months ago. Carol loudly proclaimed that certain people should probably seek out charity services instead of selfishly taking up space meant for those who genuinely belong at such a prestigious institution. The ambient noise in the dining hall completely evaporated. Dozens of students simultaneously turned their heads in absolute shock. Jacob aggressively stepped forward, loudly defending Lucy by stating that everyone knew her and that she was a brilliant student. Carol dismissed him with a furious wave of her hand, snapping that she was absolutely not speaking to him. Lucy bravely extended her card once more, asking her to simply run it through the machine. This time, Carol snatched it angrily and swiped it. A cheerful electronic beep echoed loudly in the quiet room, clearly indicating the card was perfectly valid. Yet, Carol stubbornly refused to hand over the food, crossing her arms and stating coldly that machines frequently make errors. Lucy breathed out slowly, stating that she simply did not understand what the problem was. Carol leaned in close, declaring maliciously that the real problem was that she had worked there for 20 years and she knew exactly when a person did not fit in. The cruel words hung heavily over the silent room. Jacob could no longer hold his tongue, shouting that she was being incredibly abusive and unfair. Carol snapped back that if they disliked her rules, they were more than welcome to starve somewhere else. Right at that explosive moment, a deeply calm, resonant voice echoed from behind them, politely asking for an excuse to intervene. Every single person in the vicinity turned around in unison. An older man with distinguished gray hair, wearing a simple navy blazer and holding a modest leather briefcase, calmly stepped up to the tense counter. It was Alexander Harrison. Lucy felt her heart leap into her throat as she whispered the word, "Dad." Alexander offered his daughter a wonderfully warm, reassuring smile, gently saying hello, before turning his intense, unwavering gaze entirely upon Carol. He politely requested that she explain exactly what was causing such a massive disturbance. Carol looked the older man up and down with obvious disdain. She did not see an expensive luxury watch. She saw absolutely no security detail, and she noticed nothing that screamed wealth or power. To her blinded eyes, he was just another ordinary, bothersome parent trying to interfere. She rudely snapped that the situation was absolutely none of his business. Alexander maintained his flawless composure, stating simply that his daughter merely wished to eat her lunch. Carol barked back that the girl would just have to wait. When Alexander calmly asked for a logical reason, Carol arrogantly crossed her arms, declaring loudly that she was the one who made the rules in that building. Alexander remained completely silent for a few intense seconds, before suggesting that if there was a misunderstanding, they could surely resolve it like civilized adults. Carol sneered, telling him she did not need a random stranger dictating how to do her job. Lucy gently pulled at her father's sleeve, whispering desperately that it was fine and they should just leave. But Alexander, with decades of experience reading people, recognized something profoundly painful, hidden beneath his daughter's plea. It was not fear he saw, it was the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been enduring this exact same toxic treatment for far too long. He looked at Lucy with endless compassion, realizing instantly that this was not a new problem, but merely the breaking point of a long-standing abuse. Carol slammed her hand on the counter, officially ordering Alexander to leave the serving area immediately, escalating her tone to a threatening shout. Dozens of students immediately pulled out their smartphones, the room dead silent except for the faint clicking of recording cameras. Jacob exchanged a highly nervous glance with a nearby classmate, whispering that this was about to end in an absolute disaster. Carol took a menacing step forward, screaming that if he did not walk away immediately, she would call campus security to have him forcibly removed. Alexander simply nodded his head with eerie calmness, telling her that she was perfectly within her rights to do so. That unexpectedly polite response completely threw Carol off balance. She had fully expected a screaming match, but the man's unshakable serenity deeply unsettled her. A few tense minutes later, two uniformed campus security officers pushed through the crowd. Officer Mary Smith was the very first to step forward, demanding loudly to know what was causing the massive holdup. Before Alexander could even open his mouth, Carol frantically pointed her finger, falsely claiming that the man was violently disrupting the cafeteria and aggressively refusing to follow basic staff instructions. Mary carefully evaluated Alexander, who stood completely still, his hands resting easily on his briefcase, radiating an aura of absolute peace and authority. Finding zero signs of aggression, the officer sighed and respectfully asked the gentleman for his name. Alexander was just taking a breath to reply, when the main doors of the dining hall burst open yet again. A group of highly distressed university officials practically ran into the room. Leading the frantic pack was Chancellor Isaac Anderson, who had been desperately searching the campus to escort his VIP guest to their next scheduled event. Initially, the Chancellor could not process the bizarre scene unfolding before him. But it only took one horrifying second for him to spot the billionaire philanthropist completely surrounded by security guards, agitated students, and a screaming cafeteria worker. In that terrifying instant, Isaac realized that an utterly catastrophic mistake had just occurred. He rushed forward, his face pale with panic, loudly asking Mr. Harrison if he was all right. Alexander replied calmly that he was perfectly fine, but noted dryly that this institution clearly employed people who were deeply unwell. Isaac whipped his head around, glaring furiously at Carol, and demanded an immediate explanation. Carol confidently repeated her lie, claiming the man was just an unruly parent causing a massive scene. The Chancellor stared at her in utter disbelief, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. He asked the arrogant woman if she had absolutely any idea who she was insulting. Carol smirked, brushing him off. Isaac's voice boomed across the silent cafeteria, echoing off the high ceilings, as he officially introduced the man as Mr. Alexander Harrison, CEO of Harrison Biotech, and the sole benefactor of the brand new $18 million research center. The entire cafeteria froze. Phones continued to record as the color violently drained from Carol's face. She looked back at Alexander, finally seeing the terrifying power hidden beneath his quiet demeanor. Alexander spoke softly into the silence, asking Carol if she would have treated his daughter the exact same way if he had truly been nobody. The devastating question hung in the air, requiring no answer. He added that what truly horrified him was not her ignorance of his wealth, but the terrifying thought of how many vulnerable, struggling students she had ruthlessly humiliated over her 20 years of unchecked power. By the time the sun began to set over Cambridge, the Chancellor had already taken decisive, sweeping action. Carol Reed was immediately suspended and escorted off the campus premises by security, feeling the heavy, disappointed stares of hundreds of students burning into her back. That same evening, an emergency board meeting was convened in the Chancellor's office. Alexander attended, accompanied closely by Lauren Foster, his fiercely intelligent chief legal counsel. The terrified university board fully expected the billionaire to demand massive financial retributions, or perhaps pull his massive donation entirely out of spite. However, Alexander calmly took his seat and stated clearly that he had absolutely no interest in seeking special treatment or petty revenge. The opulent room fell dead silent as he leaned forward, stating that he only wanted to know if his beloved daughter was the only victim. Lauren Foster silently placed a remarkably thick, heavy folder onto the mahogany table. She revealed that within mere hours of the incident, the legal team had been flooded with heartbreaking testimonies from dozens of former and current students. The Chancellor opened the first page with trembling hands. A quiet arts student named Samuel wrote about how he had entirely stopped eating lunch on campus because Carol constantly mocked his threadbare clothes. A brilliant former scholarship recipient named Rachel confessed that the daily humiliation had nearly caused her to abandon her studies altogether. There were dozens more just like them, painting a horrifying picture of unchecked systemic bullying. Isaac closed the folder slowly, deeply ashamed, realizing that the cancer had been growing in his institution for decades, and they had simply chosen to look the other way. Meanwhile, the dramatic video secretly recorded by Jacob was rapidly spreading across the internet like wildfire. It did not showcase violent screaming or dramatic physical altercations. Instead, it captured a profound masterclass in human dignity. It highlighted Lucy's heartbreaking patience, Alexander's unshakable, polite composure, Carol's ugly arrogance, and the breathtaking silence that fell when the absolute truth was finally revealed. Millions of people watched and shared the footage, not simply because a famous billionaire was involved, but because almost everyone alive has, at some point, felt the crushing weight of being unfairly judged by someone in power. Before finally leaving the beautiful Cambridge campus to return to New York, Alexander found Lucy sitting quietly on a secluded wooden bench beneath a massive oak tree. He sat down heavily beside her, the cool evening breeze rustling the autumn leaves above them. For many long minutes, neither father nor daughter felt the need to speak. It was Lucy who finally broke the comforting silence, whispering a tearful apology for never telling him the truth about the daily abuse. Alexander gently wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. He softly kissed the top of her head, telling her with absolute certainty that she never had to apologize for trying to be brave. She lowered her eyes, admitting that she honestly believed she could handle the pain all by herself. He gently squeezed her hand, reminding her that true strength does not mean suffering in absolute silence, when people who love you are ready to fight by your side. The historic campus bells began to chime melodically in the distance, signaling the end of the day. They both understood that this day did not merely mark the dramatic end of a painful chapter, but the beautiful beginning of a profound transformation the university desperately needed. 3 months later, a thick blanket of pristine white snow had completely transformed the historic city of Cambridge into a winter wonderland. The sweeping internal investigations had officially confirmed that the abuse was entirely systemic, leading to the permanent termination of Carol Reed and the implementation of incredibly strict zero-tolerance respect protocols across all campus facilities. Alexander Harrison had not withdrawn a single penny of his $18 million donation, but he had legally added one vital, unchangeable stipulation to the contract. He demanded that the Ivy Harrison Center must forever stand as a reminder that human knowledge is completely worthless if we forget the basic dignity of the human soul. In the wake of the scandal, Lucy and Jacob passionately launched a massive student-led initiative called the Open Table Project. Upperclassmen eagerly volunteered to sit and share meals with nervous freshmen or lonely students, ensuring absolutely nobody would ever have to face isolation or judgment in the dining halls again. By late December, the cafeteria was completely unrecognizable, filled with joyous laughter, warm conversations, and an atmosphere of genuine, protective community under the wonderful leadership of Chloe Moore, the kind-hearted new manager. During the annual Winter Family Weekend, the dining hall was packed with visiting parents, standing patiently in line alongside their children. Alexander Harrison stood quietly among them, waiting his turn with a simple plastic tray. Chloe instantly recognized the famous benefactor and politely offered to let him skip the massive line. Alexander smiled warmly, declining the offer and stating that today he was simply a proud father hoping to eat lunch with his brilliant daughter. When he finally reached the front, he received the exact same warm, respectful greeting as every single person before him, proving that true change had finally taken root. The profound lesson hidden within the quiet footsteps of Alexander Harrison and his daughter Lucy reminds us that the true measure of our character is never found in the weight of our wallets, but in the gentle grace we offer to those who cannot do anything for us. In a world that constantly rushes to judge the worn fabric of a coat or the silence of a stranger, we frequently forget that every single person we casually pass by is fighting a complex, hidden battle we know absolutely nothing about. True wisdom, especially as we gather the years, teaches us that responding to bitter cruelty with unshakable, polite serenity is the most powerful weapon a human heart can possibly wield. Arrogance may forcefully demand immediate attention, but it is deeply rooted, quiet empathy that ultimately commands lasting, generational respect. We must strive to remember that the grand titles we hold and the wealth we accumulate will eventually fade into absolute dust. But the profound emotional scars we leave on the vulnerable, or the loving light we manage to spark in their darkest hours, will echo throughout eternity. Whenever you find yourself in a position of authority, never use it to build walls of humiliation. Instead, use your blessed position to pull others up, offering them a seat at the table of human dignity. Because the ultimate legacy of a life well lived is simply how much kinder the world became while you were in it.